Mirëmëngjesi gjithëve, nderuar panelist, pjesëmarrës, media të nderuara dhe shumë të respektuara, kam kënaqësinë dhe nderin njëkohësisht që të bëj hapjen e kësaj konference rreth temës të cilën e kemi quajtur Zeri Popullit rreth finales së madhe ndërmjet Kosovës dhe Serbisë, që njëkohësisht shënon edhe publikimin e vëllimit të dytë të studimit respektivisht sondazhit, të cilin e kemi zbatuar, zhvilluar me qytetarët e Kosovës brenda periudhës kohore 21 deri me 28 maj 2019. Përpara se të bëjmë hapjen e diskutimeve dhe prezantimeve në tryezë, më lejoni që fillimisht i përshëndes panelistët e nderuar, duke filluar me presidentin e Republikës së Kosovës, zotin Hashim Thaçi, nënkryetarin e Lidhjes Demokratike të Kosovës, zotin Lutfi Haziri, kryetarin e Partisë Social-Demokrate, zotin Shpend Ahmeti, dhe së shpejti po presim që të na bashkohet edhe kryetari i Lëvizjes Vetëvendosje, zotin Albin Kurti. Gjithashtu, një falënderim të veçantë shkon për profesorin Antoni Hith nga Universiteti i Oxfordit, që realisht e ka mbikëqyrur dhe e ka draftuar raportin të cilin e prezantojmë sot. Përpara se të fillojmë me diskutimet përmbajtësore të kësaj konference, më lejoni që t'ja jap fjalën ambasadorit norvegjez në Kosovë, zotit Per Strand Sjastat, duke pasur parasysh këtu edhe faktin se është Ministria e Punëve të Jashtme e Norvegjisë, respektivisht ambasada norvegjeze në Kosovë, që ka mbështetur studimin, respektivisht sondazhin e këtij raporti dhe gjithashtu edhe këtë konferencë të sotme. Prandaj pa humbur kohë ja jap fjalën ambasadorit Per Strand Sjastat.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here this morning with you all. President, deputies, mayors, colleagues. Let me first say that Norway applauds the Prespa agreement between North Macedonia and Greece. Although the conflicts are different in nature, I do hope that the courage and leadership shown by Greece and North Macedonia will serve as an inspiration for others as well. The rewards are clear and important and visible. North Macedonia is now becoming a member of NATO, as you will be aware, and the prospects of opening membership negotiations with the EU later this year seems to be good. We encourage Kosovo and Serbia to resume and conclude the normalization dialogue. This will provide new opportunities, the so-called peace dividends, and open doors that today are closed for Kosovo. The rreth Research Institute has made 2 surveys about the views of ordinary citizens, the first in January and the last one now in May. The purpose of the 2 surveys is to give decision makers a point of reference when conducting the dialogue, when mapping out the options, and when making priorities. The survey is part of a more comprehensive rreth project supported by the Norwegian Embassy for some time. From the survey, it's interesting to note that the vast majority of Kosovo citizens support the dialogue. The main message seems to be that people want change. For the moment, however, unilateral actions from both Kosovo and Serbia are making it hard to achieve any progress in the dialogue. I hope that all parties, as soon as possible, will give the dialogue a fair chance to succeed. A positive step would be for both countries to take steps to implement all agreements already signed in Brussels. In addition, only by showing restraints in statements and behavior, it will be possible to create the more positive environment and atmosphere needed to succeed. It would also be helpful, obviously, to have more consensus and cooperation across party lines in Kosovo. Political parties agree on the need for mutual recognition, that is clear, but there is no consensus on the timeline or on possible solutions or possible concessions. It is, of course, not for me to say what the solution should be. That should be left for the parties themselves. I do believe, however, that the time factor is relevant. I hope that a mutually acceptable agreement can be reached within reasonable time, perhaps later this year or sometime next year. Postponing the process until later may always involve some risks. It is difficult to predict the future context, both domestically and internationally. It would also delay the political and economic benefits that Kosovo would get by becoming a full member of the international community. Let me conclude. I hope that the IDEA project and the survey being presented here today will be helpful for the ongoing debates and discussions on the dialogue in this country. I also hope that the government will build trust and ensure an inclusive dialogue process in the months ahead. Everyone should engage in a constructive way in the parliament or other arenas of relevance. Fragmentation will only make Kosovo weak. More consensus and cooperation will make your country stronger. Thank you very much.
Faleminderit, Zoti Ambasador. Përpara se të ja jap fjalën profesorit Antoni Hill që të bëj prezantimin e studimit, vetëm si hyrje fillestare, si një lloj preludi uvertyre rreth gjetjeve, 3 gjetjeve kryesore të sondazhit. I kemi testuar, do të thotë sikur se herën e kaluar, 3 skenar. Dhe mbështetja e qytetarëve të Kosovës për këto skenar ka qenë me sa vjen. Për vazhdimin e status quo-s janë 7% e qytetarëve të Kosovës. Për asociacionin me kompetenca ekzekutive në këmbim të njohjes de facto nga Serbia janë 9% e qytetarëve të Kosovës dhe për korrigjimin e kufive që do të rezultonte me njohjen globale të Kosovës dhe antarësimin e Kosovës në OKB, mbështetja është 32% e qytetarëve të Kosovës. Këto janë vetëm gjetjet bazike, themelore, për gjetjet tjera plotësuese do të bëj prezantimin e detajuar profesori Antoni Hill nga Universiteti i Oxfordit. Kështu që më lejoni t'ja jap fjalën profesorit Antoni Hill për më tepër.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be here again. I'd like to begin by thanking the Norwegian ambassador who has just spoken for his support for this project, which has been invaluable for us. So we're very grateful to Norway. I'd also like to begin by thanking my colleagues in RIDEA. I'm giving the presentation. The aim of the survey is to present the vox populi, the voice of the people. In a previous survey, we talked about the silent majority speaks. So the idea of the survey is to give the silent majority a chance for their voice to be heard. we're going to cover three main issues: whether the dialogue should be continued, the attitudes of the public in Kosovo, both Albanians and Serbs, towards different scenarios, and the underlying reasons for their support or lack of support for the different options. And we're also going to talk briefly about changes since our previous survey. The survey is a representative sample of the population in Kosovo. It was conducted across all the municipalities in Kosovo using proportional sampling and based on random route sampling procedures. We oversampled the Serb population in order to have adequate sample size for making comparisons between the views of Albanians and Serbs in Kosovo. And we've also given some other details on the slide about the distribution, the geographical distribution, the age and gender of our sample. So moving on straight away to the results, our first question is, do you agree with the halting of dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia? And here we can see from the left-hand column that the most common view is against halting the dialogue, although there is division in the public about this issue, with a substantial number who actually are would be willing to halt the dialogue. So there are concerns which I will come back to. However, perhaps the main point to make on this slide is that the views of the Albanian and the Serbian samples that we have in our survey are very similar on this issue. It is easy to imagine that the two communities are opposed to each other, but what I want to bring out is the large number of ways in which there is agreement and in which the two communities speak with one voice. And this is an example, as we can see, where there is a great deal of similarity in the views of the two communities. I should also mention a small finding which comes up across much of the survey, namely that the Serb sample seems to be a little bit less certain about their answers. We find a rather high proportion of Serb respondents who said that they didn't know and didn't have a view on the issues. And we need to remember, both among the Serbs and the Albanians, that there are quite a number of people who are not sure what their views might be. So there is still some uncertainty in the population about what should be done. So we now look at the three main scenarios which we mentioned to our respondents. The first scenario, continuation of the status quo. The second scenario was to give extended executive powers for the Kosovo-Serb Association in return for recognition from Serbia. And the third scenario was border adjustments in the hope that they might lead to a final resolution leading to the global recognition of Kosovo and open the path for membership of the UN and other bodies, as the Norwegian ambassador was suggesting. So let's start with scenario one, the continuation of the status quo. And here there is a very clear, unambiguous story that the public are not happy with the status quo. 89% are either very little or not at all satisfied with the continuation of the status quo. And again, we find that the two communities speak with more or less one voice on that. So the overwhelming majority of both communities are dissatisfied with the present arrangements. As you can see, again, a significant number of the Serbian respondents weren't sure, said they didn't know, and a slightly higher proportion of them were satisfied. But in general, there is broad agreement between both communities that the status quo is not sustainable. In our survey, we asked some follow-up questions of the respondents to ask them for their reasons and their thinking behind the answers they had given. And in the next slide, we look at the reasons given by the Serb and Albanian samples for why they were dissatisfied with the status quo. And the interesting story here is that there are some differences in the perspectives of the two communities. So what we find is that the Albanian community are particularly concerned about the difficulty of concrete moves towards European integration, achieving global recognition, and of course also achieving peaceful relations, normalization with Serbia. There's a somewhat different set of priorities among the Serbian respondents who've emphasized more, in relative terms, the need to resolve the internal problems facing the Serb community. So here we see somewhat different perspectives between the two communities. I'll come back to this, but different perspectives can in fact be an opportunity rather than a problem when one comes to negotiations. The second scenario is the de facto recognition from Serbia, providing that there is extended executive powers granted to the Kosovo-Serb Association. Again, we find that overall, people are not happy with this scenario. Overall, 86% of the respondents disagree to some extent with granting extended executive powers to the Kosovo-Serb Association. However, as you might have expected, the views of the two communities differ in some important ways, with the overwhelming majority of the Albanian respondents being opposed to extended executive powers. There's more support among the Serb population, but even among the Serbs, there are substantial divisions. So it is not a case of complete polarization. There are differences even within the Serb community about the desirability of extended executive powers. So we've got around a third of the Serbs who strongly agree with the measure and another third who strongly disagree. So there are divisions, and again, quite a high proportion who don't have a view on this issue. So public opinion is not entrenched, at least among the Serb respondents. We then followed up with questions asking people, those people who wanted extended executive powers, what their reasoning was, and with those who didn't want it, what their reasoning was. So we've got two panels, One on the left is the reasons you agree with granting extended executive powers, and on the right, it's why you disagree. So these questions were asked of different sets of respondents. And one of the key reasons in the left-hand panel we can see is that a substantial majority among the Serbs, the red bar, say it will give Serbs who live in Kosovo more say in the decision-making process. So again, an emphasis on the internal problems facing the Serb community in Kosovo and extending their say in the decision-making process. However, in the right-hand panel, the reasons for dissatisfaction, we find range of concerns among the Albanian population. The Albanian population particularly concerned that extended executive powers might open the door for a mini Republika Srpska in Kosovo. So there is great concern among the Albanian population in Kosovo that the measure would entrench divisions in an unfortunate way in the country as a whole. So again, we find different perspectives on this issue from the two communities. Moving on to scenario 3, the scenario of border adjustment in return for global recognition of Kosovo. Again, we find that there is little overall agreement with this scenario, although there is more support for it than for the first two scenarios. In other words, if we look at the two left-hand columns and we add those up together, that comes to a third of the population overall who are supportive of border adjustment. So it's only a third, it's not a majority, but it's more, a higher proportion than are in favour of continuation of the status quo or extended executive powers. So the key point here is there is a willingness, some willingness to contemplate change in order to secure a resolution for the issues. Again, we look at the extent of agreement or disagreement between the two communities, and again we see that the two communities speak with one voice, that the bars are very similar for the two communities. So again, I want to emphasize the extent to which the two communities on many of these issues are in agreement. So there are similar perspectives. And we asked, again, the reasons in the left-hand panel. We asked people why a border adjustment would be acceptable, of those people who thought it was acceptable, and on the right-hand panel, we looked for reasons why people thought border adjustment would be unacceptable. Again, some difference in views on this, but the one on the right-hand panel that is perhaps most striking is the column where 93% of the Albanian respondents said that Kosovo agreed with the reasoning that Kosovo is an independent country which should be given global recognition and UN membership without having to get involved in the border adjustment scenario. So a feeling that as an independent country, Kosovo should not have to be making major concessions of this sort. So a feeling that perhaps this is my interpretation, that countries should not be forced towards the kind of solution that in a sense should be theirs of right. So I think one has to recognize that there is some concern, some considerable concern about negotiations of this sort. We also asked a couple of questions about support for US and EU policy. And here, perhaps the most surprising result is we found that there was more support for the US policy than for EU policy among the Albanian respondents. My interpretation, my guess, is that this is a legacy of the American involvement in the original conflict and is, if you like, an acknowledgement of the key role played by American President Bill Clinton, whose picture I still see in Pristina. So there are interesting differences in the Albanian sample's attitudes towards the US and EU. So if I can summarize now, the majority of the Kosovo population is against halting the dialogue. However, there is little agreement on the way forward, or except there is no support for the continuation of the status quo, overwhelming agreement that the status quo is unsatisfactory. There is very little support for granting executive powers for the Kosovo Serb Association, but there is more support, reaching almost a third of the sample, for border adjustment in order to resolve the problems. But no scenario gets overall support, although there is a willingness to contemplate change. These results largely replicate the results that we found in our first survey, so that the public opinion has not fundamentally changed, both the extent of support or otherwise for the different scenarios and the extent to which the communities agree. So in most respects, the present survey reiterates and reinforces the findings from the first survey. However, there are a number of indications of what could be interpreted as increasing frustration with the lack of progress in resolving the outstanding issues between Serbia and Kosovo. There is increased dissatisfaction with the status quo, up from 79% dissatisfaction in our first survey to 89% in the second survey. There is also, perhaps surprisingly, declining support for continuation of the dialogue, down from 62% to 50%. This may also be a sign of dissatisfaction and frustration at the lack of progress. If the dialogue continues without leading to any resolution, then inevitably people will get frustrated and will want to stop it. There is also, perhaps most worryingly, evidence of, in some respects, increased polarization between the two communities. Whereas the communities on the issue of executive powers for the Kosovo Serb Association, the gap between the two communities has widened quite dramatically. So again, there are worrying concerns that divisions may become more entrenched the longer the process carries on. So what we find is that the perspectives of the two communities differ in some respects, for example, on extended executive powers, but that there are differences in perspective, not necessarily always opposition, that the Serb respondents to the survey were particularly concerned about the situation of the Serb community in Kosovo, about the internal situation, the lack of decision-making power. Whereas Albanian respondents, in reply to our earlier follow-up questions, were very worried about the risk of developing a mini Republika Srpska. So the example of Bosnia is not a happy one from the point of view of the Albanian respondents here in Kosovo. And the Albanian respondents were also more concerned about external issues such as integration with the EU than were the Serbian respondents. But these differing perspectives are not necessarily mutually contradictory. EU integration does not necessarily involve any one specific solution for the internal problems. So in other words, we should not be thinking of this as what is called a zero-sum game, where any gains for one side have to be at the expense of losses for the other. If you have different perspectives, there is the possibility of finding solutions which meet the differing concerns of the two populations. So it is not a case of winner take all. You have different problems to be solved in order to reach the aspirations, meet the aspirations of both communities. So if I can conclude, the Albanian and the Serb populations of Kosovo speak with very different voices on some issues, but with one voice on the unsatisfactory nature of the status quo. There is no substantial support for any of the three scenarios as currently formulated, but the perspectives of the two main communities, although they differ in many respects, are not always mutually incompatible. And therefore, there is a possibility of looking for creative solutions which address the distinctive and different concerns of the two communities. And this could be a way forward. The survey research is not pessimistic about the possibilities. The existing scenarios do not get majority assent, but there is an openness to change, to consider change, and I think there are possibilities of finding ways forward that meet the differing concerns of the two communities. Thank you.